The banker set his pen down like it weighed 10 pounds and looked at me the way you'd look at a calf that had wandered into the wrong pen. It was Tuesday, the 9th of March, 1954, and outside the window of the Auburn State Bank, the thermometer nailed to the brick read 26 degrees, with a wind working down from South Dakota that rattled the glass every time a truck passed on Highway 75. 3 years, he said. That's what the board approved, not 5. 3 years on $1,100, and I want you to understand what that means, son, because I don't think you do. I was 18 years old, 6 weeks off my grandfather's funeral, and I understood exactly what it meant. It meant a due date in September of 1957, a number that would sit behind my eyes every morning for the next 3 harvests, the way a held breath sits in your chest. It meant 60 acres of ground my grandfather himself had taken to calling burned dirt in his last years. Ground worked so hard and so long on the same 3 crops that the co-op agent had stopped bothering to test it, because there wasn't anything left in it worth testing for. You've got 60 acres that won't carry a mortgage, let alone a farm, the banker went on. Your neighbors have told me as much. Told me you'd be selling out by fall, and they'd be the ones to help you do it fair. I didn't say anything to that. My grandfather used to tell me that a man who argues with a fool teaches the fool nothing and himself less, and I'd decided somewhere in the last 6 weeks that I was going to be the kind of man who remembered things like that instead of just hearing them. What I said was that I'd sign the note. He slid the paper across, and I signed it in the black ink of the bank's own pen, my hand steadier than I expected it to be, and I remember thinking that the ink dried faster than I wanted it to, like even the paper was in a hurry to see whether I'd fail. 3 years. Not a season, not a decade. 3 harvests, 60 acres, 1 loan, and a bank in Auburn, Nebraska that had already decided how the story would end before I'd planted a single row. I drove the 11 miles home in my grandfather's 1948 Ford pickup, the heater doing next to nothing, the fields on either side of the gravel road gray and stubbled and waiting on a thaw that felt a long way off. I kept doing the arithmetic in my head the whole way. 36 months, minus the 2 I'd already spent settling the estate, minus whatever winter took from me before I even got a plow in the ground. I didn't know yet that the answer to all of it was sitting in a cellar I hadn't opened since I was 9 years old, under a shelf of my grandmother's canning jars, waiting on somebody patient enough to go looking. The house was cold when I got back, the kind of cold that sits in the plaster and doesn't care what the stove is doing. I remember it was a Tuesday, the 9th of March, because I'd written the date on the loan papers not 20 minutes before, and it was still fresh in my head, and I stood in the kitchen a long while before I did anything, just listening to the place tick and settle around me, like it was deciding whether to trust me either. 60 acres. My grandfather had called it burned dirt more than once, not as a figure of speech but as a diagnosis, the way a doctor says a lung's gone. 2 decades of corn on corn on corn, no rotation, no rest. Chemical nitrogen dumped on every spring because the county agent and the co-op both said that was modern farming, that was the future, and my grandfather had believed them the way a tired man believes whoever's talking the loudest. By the time I signed those papers, the ground didn't hold water right. It crusted. Rain ran off it instead of into it, the way water runs off a table instead of a sponge. I didn't go down to the cellar that night. I want to say I did, that I felt some pull toward it, but the truth is, I went down there because the woodpile by the back door had run low, and my grandmother had always kept extra kindling stacked against the cellar's north wall, dry, out of the weather. I took the lantern instead of the electric bulb because the wiring down there had never been trusted by anyone in the family, going back to when the county first ran lines through in '38, and I picked my way past the shelves of jars, beans, tomatoes, chow-chow gone dark with age, toward the kindling. That's when I saw the trunk. It wasn't hidden exactly. It had just always been there, the way a chair in a corner stops being seen after enough years. Cedar, iron-strapped. the kind my grandmother had brought from her people's place in Richardson County when she married. I'd been in that cellar 100 times as a boy and never once thought to open it, because a 9-year-old doesn't wonder what's inside his grandmother's trunk any more than he wonders what's inside a church wall. I set the lantern on the shelf and knelt down in the dirt floor's cold, and the latch gave easier than I expected, like it had been waiting on someone to try it. Inside there was a good wool blanket, moth-eaten at one corner, a man's pocket watch that wasn't my grandfather's, and underneath both of those, wrapped in oilcloth gone stiff and yellow, a leather notebook with her initials burned into the cover, in a hand I didn't recognize as hers at all. The initials weren't hers by marriage, EMK, not the H that my grandfather's name would have given her, and I sat there a long moment with the lantern throwing my shadow huge against the shelves of dark jars, turning that over. Her people's name, maybe, from before Richardson County, before any of it. I didn't open the cover right away. I want to say that was patience, but it wasn't. It was the kind of hesitation a man gets before a letter he's been waiting on, where the waiting itself has started to feel like the last safe minute he's got. It was Tuesday, the 9th of March, 1954, and I had 11 months and some change left on a 3-year note that Farmers State Bank of Auburn had signed against 60 acres my grandfather used to call burned dirt to my face and worse behind it. Mr. Iverson at the bank had given me until the fall of 1957 to show him black soil instead of the gray, cracked kind that blew off in a west wind, and every day between then and now was a day I could count, and had been counting, on a calendar tacked above the stove with the crossed-off squares getting thicker toward the bottom of each month. So I opened it. The first page held no date, just her hand, small, slanted, pressed hard enough into the paper that I could feel the letters from the back side. And it began, not with a greeting or a title, but with a number, 40 pounds of bone char to 1 wagon load of manure, turned no less than 4 times before the first frost. Below that, in ink gone the color of weak coffee, she'd written a line that stopped me cold in that cellar with the lantern guttering. Ground, don't forget what you feed it, and it don't forget what you starve it neither. I turned the page, and there were more numbers. Trench depths, weeks, temperatures she must have judged by hand and weather rather than any thermometer, because there wasn't one in the house that I'd ever seen work, and sketches, crude but careful, of long shallow ditches laid out in rows across what I recognized, with a jolt that went up through my knees before it reached my chest, as the exact same 60 acres I was kneeling 12 feet beneath. Somewhere above me the wind had picked up, working at a loose shingle the way it had been all winter, and I heard it and didn't move, because I understood already, sitting in that cold with jars of my dead grandmother's tomatoes watching me like a jury, that whatever this notebook held was going to cost me something before it gave me anything back, and I had, by my own count tacked to the kitchen wall, 1,031 days left to decide whether I could afford it. I sat with that number a long while, the lantern throwing its shrinking circle over the shelf of jars, and I did the arithmetic the way I'd been taught to do all arithmetic that mattered. Slow, twice, on paper if I had it. 1,031 days. 2 winters, and most of a third, stretched out ahead of me like a plowed field with no far fence in sight, and somewhere at the end of it, a banker in a starched collar, who'd already told me once, across a desk too wide for a boy my size, that 60 acres of burned dirt wasn't collateral for anything but sympathy, and he wasn't in the business of selling that. I turned back through the notebook page by page, careful with the binding, which had gone soft and split at the spine, the way old harness leather splits, not all at once, but along one seam first, then another. She dated some of the entries. March of 1931, a dry August in 33, when she'd written only held anyway, and nothing else for 11 days running. There was a recipe, if you could call it that, worked out in her own hand for what she called the black feed, bone scrap, ash, manure, turned and buried, and left to work on itself in the dark, the way a wound works on itself under a bandage, slow, unseen, and not to be checked too often or it wouldn't take. I thought about my grandfather then, though the notebook never once mentioned him by what he'd done, only by absence, a line here where the entries simply stopped for 4 years, resuming afterward in a hand that had gotten smaller, more cramped, as if she were trying to take up less room on the page. I knew what had happened in those 4 years without her writing it down. The bank had come, same as it always came, and he'd bought what the fertilizer salesman from Omaha was selling, instead of trusting what his wife had already proven in the ground. And the land had given big for a while, the way a man will run hard on borrowed strength before his knees go out from under him. Above me, the shingle worked loose another 1/4 inch in the wind, and I heard it give, and I knew I'd be up on that roof myself inside the week whether I'd solved anything down here or not, because a house doesn't wait on a man's arithmetic. I closed the notebook and held it flat against my chest, the way you'd hold something that might still be breathing, and I climbed the cellar stairs into a kitchen gone dark and cold, already turning over in my head how a boy with one loan, and no equipment to speak of, was going to dig trenches across 60 acres before the ground froze solid enough to stop a shovel. The shingle held through the night, but only just. I found it curled back like a lip when I went out at first light on Thursday, the 6th of November, and I nailed it flat before the coffee had even finished boiling on the stove, because a man learns fast that some repairs won't wait on breakfast. Frost had come early that year, a hard skim of white across the yard that told me the ground still had some give left in it, but not much, maybe 3 weeks, maybe less, if the wind kept coming down out of the north the way it had been. I stood on the roof longer than the job required, looking out over 60 acres that didn't look like anything special from up there, flat, gray-brown, tired, and I did the arithmetic my grandmother's notebook had started for me the night before. 3 years. That was the note the bank had written me, 36 months from the day I signed it in September, and I had already burned 2 of those months just getting the house from falling down around me and the stock fed through a hard frost. If her method needed a season to break down before it could feed anything, and another season after that to show in a stand of corn worth counting, I was down to 1 real run at it before the 3rd harvest had to answer for itself. I climbed down off that roof with my knees aching from the cold and stood in the yard doing sums in my head, the way another man might pray, and neither one felt like it was doing much good yet. The trenches were the problem. She'd written about digging channels 2 feet down, layering bone char and manure and old straw, letting it sit through a winter and turn dark before it went anywhere near a planted row. 2 feet down across even 10 acres was more shovel work than one boy could manage, before the ground locked up hard as the church steps in January. I had no tractor worth the name, no money for one, and no neighbor fool enough to lend me his time on a scheme that hadn't proven itself since before most of them were born. What I did have was the rendering plant 11 miles east on the county road, and a manager there named Otis Kemper who'd been paying farmers a nickel a load just to haul the bone scrap and blood meal off his lot before it backed up and stank out the whole township. Nobody wanted that work. Nobody wanted to smell like that in town on a Saturday. But I stood in that frozen yard doing my arithmetic, and for the first time, it looked less like a shame a man might carry and more like the only cargo I could afford. The first Monday of February 1954, I hitched the flatbed to the truck before light, my breath fogging the cab glass, and drove the 11 miles east with the radio off because there was nothing on it worth hearing that early. The rendering plant sat low and gray against the sky, steam coming off its roof vents even in that cold, and the smell reached me a half-mile out and didn't let go the whole day. The plant manager met me at the scale house in a canvas coat gone stiff with old blood, and he looked at me the way men look at a calf that's wandered somewhere it has no business being. He didn't ask why a boy wanted the work. He just told me the rate, a nickel a load, paid Fridays, no credit extended, and pointed me toward the pile. I filled that flatbed 4 times before noon, bone scrap and blood meal crusted into the boards, and by the second load, the smell had gone from something I noticed to something I simply carried, the way a man carries the smell of his own barn without knowing it's there. I hauled it back to the North 40 and shoveled it into the first trench, 2 feet down like she'd written, packing it under straw and old manure, the way you'd bank a fire for the night. My hands split in the cold. I didn't have gloves worth the name either. By Wednesday, the whole county seemed to know before I'd said a word to anyone. I drove through town for feed, and the smell rode in with me, and men I'd known my whole life stepped back a half step on the sidewalk outside the co-op, not unkind exactly, just careful, the way you're careful around a dog that might have something wrong with it. Somebody, I never did learn who first, started calling me the Bone Kid, and it stuck the way names do in a town of 1,100 people with not enough new material to talk about. I kept hauling, Tuesdays and Fridays, sometimes Saturdays when the plant let the pile build over the weekend, and every load went into the ground instead of onto a field, buried where nobody driving past could see it or judge it or laugh at it. The banknote sat behind me the whole time like a hand on my shoulder. 3 years, the note said, 3 years from the March I'd signed it, and every week that passed without a green stalk to show for it was a week closer to a debt I couldn't outrun with apology. I told myself, the ground doesn't care what a man smells like. I told myself that walking home each night, with my boots crusted and my nose long past caring, whether the ground believed it yet, was a different question entirely, and one I wouldn't have an answer to for a long while still. By the first week of April 1955, I had 11 trenches dug and covered across the North 40, each one 4 feet down and lined with the bone scrap and the barn manure and the wood ash, the way the notebook said, though the notebook never gave me a number for how long the waiting ought to take. I'd read the pages so many times the ink had started to smear where my thumb kept landing, and I still hadn't found the paragraph that told me what to do about a bank examiner named Orville Krenz, who drove out from the Auburn branch on a Wednesday, the 13th of April, to walk my fields in his town shoes and ask me, without much unkindness in his voice, whether I had anything at all to show him besides dirt that looked like dirt. I didn't, not yet. The corn wasn't in the ground. It was 3 weeks off from planting, and what I had to show him was 11 long scars across 60 acres and a smell that followed him back to his car. He wrote something in a little book of his own, the kind that made my stomach turn just to watch him do it, and he told me the bank would want to see yield, not intentions, and that intentions didn't clear a note. I planted the 20th of April that year, same day my grandfather always claimed was right if the frost had truly quit, and for 3 weeks after that I did nothing but watch. That's the part nobody warns a man about. The waiting is worse than the hauling. Hauling at least tires you enough to sleep. Waiting just sits in you. The rows over the trenched ground came up the second week of May, 4 days ahead of the rest of the field, and stood a color of green I hadn't seen on that farm since before I could walk, the kind of dark that looks almost blue in early light. I stood at the fence line at 6 in the morning on a Tuesday and counted the difference row by row, the trenched stalks standing a full 2 inches over their neighbors, and I didn't say anything to anybody about it for 4 days, because saying it out loud felt like handing it to somebody who could take it away. Orville Krenz came back the second Wednesday of June. He didn't get out of his shoes this time, walked the rows in them anyway, right into the wet ground, and stood a long while over the line where the trenched corn met the untrenched, where you could draw a ruler between one and the other. He didn't write anything that day. He just stood there working his jaw, like a man chewing on an idea he didn't want to swallow, and then he asked me, flat out, how many more trenches I meant to dig before the note came due. I told him all of them, every acre, and I watched him do the arithmetic on his own face before he ever said a word back. The arithmetic came out on his face, the way arithmetic always does on men who deal in weights and manifests, slow, then all at once. He didn't answer me. He looked past me toward the barn, toward the trench lines cut into the far 40 like long-healed scars, and he said the plant was behind on its own hauling, that the truck they'd hired out of Auburn had broken an axle the week before, and nobody wanted the extra runs in this heat. Then he left without another word about the loan, without another word about the corn, climbing back into his car with the wet ground still on his shoes. I counted the days after that the way I'd been counting them since the bank first stamped the note. Not out loud, not on a calendar tacked to the wall where anyone passing through the kitchen could see it, but in my head, walking the rows at dawn. 480-some days left before the note came due in September of 1957. I did that arithmetic more than I did any other kind that summer, more than I figured seed costs or feed bills, because the note didn't care what the corn looked like unless the corn turned into dollars by a date already fixed in ink. The hauling picked back up within the week. Bigger loads, later hours, the plant paying out on a Thursday what they used to spread over 2 trips. I ran the truck near dark some nights, the headlights catching moths thick as snow over the road, and I'd come home smelling of tallow and blood scrap with my hands raw from the winch chain, and I'd go straight out to the trenched acres before I even washed, just to stand at the fence and look, because in that hour before full dark the corn seemed to hold its own light, the tassels catching whatever was left of the sun after it had gone from everything else. Aunt Corrine started leaving the porch light on later those nights, not saying why, just leaving it lit until I came in. She never once told me to slow down. She'd only ask, some mornings over coffee, how many more trenches, like she was keeping her own count separate from mine, and I never had a different answer than the one I'd given the plant manager, all of them, every acre, before the note came due. The Krenz boy who ran feed at the co-op told me his father had come home talking about the black ground like it had gotten under his fingernails and wouldn't wash out. I didn't know what to make of that, whether it was a warning or the start of something else. I only knew the calendar in my head kept turning its pages faster than the one nailed by the kitchen door, and somewhere out past the fence line, the corn kept climbing those 2 extra inches like it had heard the same countdown I had and meant to answer it before I could. The note came due on September the 14th, 1957, a Saturday, and by the 3rd week of August I had 11 days and no way to make the calendar hold still. I counted them out loud sometimes, walking the rows before light, the way another man might count money he didn't have yet. 11 days, then 10. Mr. Voss at the bank had stopped asking me in for coffee that summer, which I took to mean he'd already decided how the conversation would go if I came up short, and didn't want the trouble of being polite about it twice. The corn had tasseled out taller than the co-op's demonstration plots by the 2nd week of August, tall enough that Elmer Krenz drove the section road twice, just to look at it from his truck window without stopping. I let him look. There wasn't anything to say that the field wasn't already saying itself. What worried me wasn't the corn. It was the wheat ground on the East 40, the last 3 trenches I'd dug that second winter, the ones I'd rushed because the frost came early that year and I hadn't wanted to lose the season. Rushed work shows itself late, my grandmother's notebook said, in her small slanted hand. On a page I'd read so many times the crease had gone soft as cloth. I walked that ground every evening that week, kneeling down to work the soil between my fingers the way she'd described, checking for the crumbling black texture against the places where it still ran pale and tired. 9 days out, I found a patch on the East 40, no bigger than a bedsheet where the wheat had come up thin and yellowing, and I sat on my heels in the dirt for the better part of 20 minutes just looking at it, doing arithmetic I didn't want to finish. It wasn't enough to sink the note. I told myself that twice. But it was enough to keep me up past midnight with the lamp lit, going back through her pages for anything I might have skipped, some line about thin ground I'd read past too quick the first 4 times. Aunt Corrine found me there at 1:30, the notebook open under the lamp, and she didn't ask what I'd found. She only refilled the coffee I'd let go cold, and sat down across from me, the porch light still burning outside the window behind her, and said the harvest crew from the Voss place would be coming through the county road by the end of the month, and that I ought to have an answer ready before they asked what that black ground of mine was going to yield. I didn't have an answer that night, only the arithmetic and the cold coffee, and the sound of the wind working at the loose shingle over the porch that nobody had fixed since November. But by Thursday, the 23rd of August, I had walked every trench on the 60 acres twice, counting stalks, the way Grandma's notebook said to count them, not by the row, but by the foot, 10 feet at a stretch, writing the numbers in the margin of her own pages, because I'd run out of room in mine. The East 40 patch stayed thin. Everything around it didn't. I set the two figures side by side and let them sit there like that was supposed to mean something, and eventually it did. 7 days left before the Voss crew came through, and 6 years of a dead woman's slow, buried patience standing between me and whatever the county was about to say about my ground. The banknote came due the 9th of September. I'd known that date the way a man knows his own birthday, without needing to check it, but somewhere in that last stretch, it stopped being a date on a paper in Mr. Halloran's drawer and became something closer to a sound, a clock I could hear if the yard got quiet enough, ticking down through the wheat and the corn and the black dirt I'd fed for 3 winters running. 17 days. I wrote the number on the inside cover of my own notebook that night, under the column of yields, and I didn't erase it when the number changed the next morning. I just wrote the new one beside it, 16. I wanted to see them stacked up like that, one after another, getting smaller. Aunt Corrine noticed. She didn't say so, but she started leaving the coffee on longer in the mornings, past when she'd usually cleared it, and she took to walking out to the fence line at dusk instead of staying on the porch, watching me from a little further off than she used to, like she'd decided the last stretch of this was mine to walk and hers to witness. Neither of us talked about what would happen if the yield came in short. We'd talked about it enough back in the winter, back when the trenches were still just black scars in the frozen ground, and nobody but a dead woman's handwriting said they'd amount to anything. 10 days out, the Voss crew's foreman, a big, slow-talking man named Earl Detrick, stopped his truck at the end of the lane without pulling in, rolled his window down, and asked me straight out, no preamble, what I figured that ground of mine was fixing to throw this year. I looked past him at the corn, tall and dark-leafed, and standing dead still in the heat, and I told him the truth, which was that I didn't know exactly, but I knew it'd be more than anybody in this county was expecting. He didn't say anything to that, just nodded once, like he'd expected the answer and didn't much care for it, and drove on toward town, leaving a thin trail of dust hanging in the still air behind him. I stood at the end of the lane a while after his truck was gone, listening to the corn talk to itself in the small wind that had started up, that dry rustle that sounds almost like rain if you don't know better, and I thought about how 9 days left wasn't really 9 days at all. It was 9 days until the county extension man came out with his measuring wheel and his notebook, and after that, the numbers would exist whether I wanted them to or not. I went back to walking the rows every evening after chores, same as I had all August, checking earfill by feel more than by eye, snapping back a husk here and there, just enough to see the kernels packed tight, clear to the tip, milk line creeping down slow and even. The wheat had already come off in July, thrashed and hauled and sold, and that number was already locked in, already banked, 31 bushels to the acre against the co-op's 24, and I'd let myself feel something about that for exactly one evening before making myself stop, because the corn was the number that mattered. The corn was what the note was written against. And there were still 8 days, then 7, then a stretch of 3, where the heat broke, and a slow rain came through for 2 days straight, and I stood on the porch and let it soak me rather than run for cover, because I knew what that rain was worth, to ground that could still hold it, instead of shedding it, the way burned dirt always had. 6 days out, my grandmother took to sitting on the porch step instead of the chair, closer to the yard, closer to where I'd come in from the fields, and she started asking me small questions she hadn't bothered with in years. What the bank president's first name was, whether Mr. Voss had ever apologized outright or just changed how he talked to me, whether I remembered which page in her notebook the manure ratios were written on. I understood, without either of us saying it, that she was gathering the story up in her mind, the way you gather up a harvest before a frost, getting it into a shape she could hold on to no matter which way this went. 5 days. 4. I didn't sleep well any of those nights. Not from worry exactly, but from the strange hum of waiting, the kind that sits behind your ribs and won't let you settle, counting down toward a number that would either prove a dead woman right or prove the whole county right, about a boy who never should have tried. 3 days out, the wheat came in first, and I stood at the edge of that field with the county extension man's clipboard numbers already circling in my head before he'd even finished his measuring. 41 bushels an acre, where the co-op's demonstration plot, planted in the same soil type not 4 miles east, had managed 31. I didn't whoop, I just stood there with my hat off, letting the wind do what it wanted with my hair, and thought about a woman who never lived to see a single stalk of it. 2 days out, the corn came in behind it, and by the time the last wagon load rattled up the lane toward the crib, I had the figures written plain in my own notebook, under hers, in the same place she'd once written her ratios of bone char to manure to old hay. The numbers didn't lie the way men sometimes did. 32% over the co-op average, near enough that nobody at the Grange Hall could argue it down to luck. 1 day out, I drove into Auburn with the receipts in an envelope on the seat beside me, past the feed store, past the diner, where old men still called me the Bone Kid, though it didn't land the way it used to. It landed like a name a place gives you that it can't quite take back. The morning the note came due, a Thursday, the 12th of September, 1957, I sat across the desk from the same bank president who'd once looked at me like I was a stray dog that had wandered into his lobby, and I counted the bills out onto the blotter myself. Principal, interest, the whole of it, and $11 left over that I folded back into my shirt pocket instead of leaving on his desk, because a man ought to walk out owing nothing to anyone, not even the last dollar in his hand. The rendering plant manager drove out that same week, the truck raising dust down the lane same as it always had, except this time he came with a paper contract instead of a nickel-a-load handshake, and he stood at my fence line asking me, not telling me, how I wanted the terms drawn. I still walk those fields most evenings, when the light goes long and orange over the fence posts, and the ground under my boots is black, clear down past where a spade will reach. Not because anybody handed it to me that way, but because it was fed, patient season after patient season, the debt it was owed. If somebody's told you you're too young, too green, too soft for the work in front of you, go open the drawer nobody's opened in 40 years. The land remembers what people forget. Tell me what you found in the comments, and if this one was worth your time, stay a while. There's more ground here worth turning over.